Jacob Thornwood sat at his wooden table, staring at the blank piece of paper in front of him. The oil lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls of his small cabin. Outside, the wind howled through the pine trees, reminding him just how alone he was up here in the Colorado mountains. He was 35 years old now. His hands were rough and calloused from years of logging work. His face was weathered by sun and wind. He'd built this cabin with his own 2 hands 5 years ago, thinking it would be the start of something, but what? He'd been living alone ever since, with only his thoughts and the occasional visit to town for supplies. The loneliness was getting to him. Not the kind where you feel sorry for yourself, but the kind that settles into your bones during those long winter nights, the kind that makes you talk to yourself just to hear a human voice. Last winter had been the worst. 3 months of heavy snow, barely able to leave the cabin for days at a time. He'd realized then that he couldn't keep living like this, so he'd made a decision. He would find a wife, not through the usual ways, of course. There weren't many unmarried women in the small mountain town 12 miles down the trail, and the few who were there had no interest in a rough logger who lived in the middle of nowhere. No, he'd have to do what other men in his situation did. He'd have to write to one of those matrimonial agencies back east. Jacob picked up his pencil and started to write. He wasn't good with words, never had been. School hadn't lasted long for him, but he tried to be honest about what he could offer. He wrote about his cabin, describing it plainly. 2 rooms, a wood stove, a well nearby. He mentioned his logging work, how he made enough money to get by but would never be wealthy. He described the winters, how harsh they could be, how isolated they became. He wanted no misunderstandings. Any woman who came here needed to know exactly what she was getting into. Then came the hard part. What kind of woman was he looking for? Jacob thought about this carefully. He'd seen beautiful women in town, the ones who turned every man's head. But those women needed things he couldn't provide. They needed fancy dresses and social gatherings and conversation about things he didn't understand. They needed a different kind of life. He wrote that he wanted a practical woman, someone who wouldn't mind hard work, someone who could handle the solitude. And then, after a moment's hesitation, he added that he preferred a woman of plain appearance. Not because he had anything against beauty, but because he figured a plain woman would be more likely to stay. She'd be grateful for what he could offer. She wouldn't be looking over her shoulder for something better. He sealed the letter and took it to town the next week, paying the postmaster to send it to a matrimonial service in Boston. Then he waited. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles away in that very city, Eleanor Hastings was facing her own crisis. She stood in the parlor of what used to be her home, watching as men cataloged her furniture. Everything was being taken to pay her late husband's debts. The creditors had been patient at first, giving her time to grieve. But patience only lasted so long, and the truth had come out. Her husband, may he rest in peace, had been a terrible businessman. He'd borrowed money from everyone, always sure his next venture would succeed. It never did. Eleanor was 28 years old and completely alone. Her parents were dead. She had no siblings. Her husband's family wanted nothing to do with her, blaming her somehow for his failures. And now she had nothing. In a week, she'd be out on the street. She'd tried to find work, but Boston had more women looking for jobs than jobs available. The positions she could get, seamstress, laundry worker, factory hand, barely paid enough for a bed in a boarding house, let alone food. She'd heard stories about what happened to women who couldn't make ends meet in the city, stories she didn't want to become part of. That's when her landlady, taking pity on her, showed her an advertisement in the newspaper. A matrimonial agency, seeking women willing to travel west to marry frontier men. Eleanor had dismissed the idea at first. It seemed desperate, even dangerous. But as the days passed and her options dwindled, she found herself thinking about it more and more. She went to the agency's office one afternoon, almost hoping they'd turn her away so she wouldn't have to make this choice. The woman who ran it, Mrs. Porter, looked her up and down with a practiced eye. "You're a pretty one," Mrs. Porter said. "Shouldn't have trouble finding a match." She showed Eleanor several letters from men seeking wives. Some were clearly looking for beauty. Others wanted women who could cook or sew. Eleanor read through them, feeling more uncomfortable with each one. Then she came across Jacob's letter. It was different from the others. Blunt, honest, almost apologetic. He wasn't promising an easy life. He was promising a real one. And that line about wanting a plain woman, It gave her an idea. What if she simply didn't tell him? What if she described herself in vague terms, sent a photograph that didn't show her clearly? Once she was there, once she'd traveled all that way, would it really matter? Eleanor knew it was dishonest. But desperation makes people do things they never thought they would. She wrote back to Jacob, carefully crafting her letter. She described herself as ordinary, unremarkable, a woman used to hard work. She found an old photograph of herself, taken years ago in dim light where her features were barely visible. She sent it along with her letter. Jacob's reply came faster than she expected. He accepted her. He sent money for the train journey west. He gave her a date to arrive. Eleanor packed her few remaining possessions into 2 small trunks. She wore her mother's wedding ring, the only piece of jewelry the creditors hadn't taken, and she boarded a train heading west, her heart pounding with fear and something that might have been hope. The journey took 3 weeks. Eleanor watched the landscape change outside her window. The crowded cities gave way to farmland, then plains, then mountains. The further west she traveled, the more remote everything became. She began to understand just how isolated Jacob's home must be. She practiced what she'd say when he saw her. How she'd explain, but no explanation sounded good enough. She'd lied to him. She'd deceived him about something that would be obvious the moment they met. Would he send her back? Would he be angry? She had no money left for a return ticket. If he rejected her, she'd be stranded in a strange place with nowhere to go. The train finally pulled into the small mountain town on a cold October afternoon. Eleanor stepped onto the platform, her legs shaky from weeks of travel. She looked around at the rough buildings, the muddy streets, the mountains looming in every direction. And there, standing near a wagon, was a tall man with broad shoulders and nervous eyes. He was scanning the arriving passengers, clearly looking for someone. Eleanor took a deep breath, picked up her bags, and walked toward him. There was no turning back now. "Mr. Thornwood?" she asked, her voice barely steady. The man turned to look at her and his face went completely pale. Jacob couldn't move. He just stood there staring at the woman in front of him like he'd seen a ghost. This couldn't be her. This couldn't be the plain, practical woman who'd written to him about being unremarkable. The woman standing before him was beautiful. Not in a simple way, but in a way that made his throat go dry. She had chestnut hair pinned up under a worn traveling hat, eyes the color of autumn leaves, and features that belonged in one of those paintings he'd seen once in a hotel lobby. Even her traveling clothes, though dusty and wrinkled from weeks on the train, couldn't hide the fact that she carried herself like someone who'd been raised with refinement. "Mr. Thornwood," she said again, and he realized he hadn't answered her. His voice came out rough. He cleared his throat. "I'm Jacob Thornwood. I'm Eleanor Hastings." She set down one of her bags and extended her hand. "I believe you're expecting me." Jacob looked at her hand, then at her face, then back at her hand. His mind was racing. This had to be some kind of mistake, or worse, some kind of trick. Maybe she was a con artist who'd intercepted the real Eleanor's letters. Maybe the real Eleanor was still back east somewhere and this woman was here to rob him or embarrass him. "You're not who I expected," he said flatly. Eleanor's face fell. She pulled her hand back. "I know, I can explain. May I show you something?" She reached into her bag and pulled out a bundle of letters tied with string. His letters. The ones he'd sent to her over the past 2 months. She also pulled out the photograph he'd sent of himself, standing stiffly in front of his cabin. "I am Eleanor Hastings," she said quietly. "I'm the woman who wrote to you. I know I wasn't entirely truthful about my appearance, but everything else I told you was true." Jacob felt anger rising in his chest. Not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, bitter kind that comes from feeling foolish. He'd been honest with her. Painfully honest. He'd told her about his rough life, his limited education, his isolated cabin. And she'd lied to him about the one thing that mattered most. "Why?" he asked. Eleanor glanced around. Other people from the train were watching them now, curious about the tense exchange. "Could we discuss this somewhere more private? Perhaps on the way to your home?" Jacob wanted to tell her to get back on the next train east. But he could see she was exhausted. And despite his anger, something in him couldn't just abandon her at the train station, no matter how deceived he felt. He was raised better than that. "Fine," he said shortly. "Wagon's over there." He picked up her trunks without another word and loaded them into the back of his wagon. Eleanor climbed up onto the seat, arranging her skirts. Jacob climbed up beside her, released the brake, and started the horses moving. They didn't speak for the first hour. The wagon rolled along the dirt road that led up into the mountains, and Jacob kept his eyes fixed straight ahead. His hands gripped the reins tighter than necessary. Beside him, Eleanor sat stiffly, clearly aware of his anger. The truth was, Jacob didn't know what he was feeling. Anger, yes, but also something else. Something that frightened him more than the anger did. From the moment he'd seen her, his body had reacted in ways he hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. The attraction was immediate and powerful, and it made him furious with himself as much as with her. A woman like that didn't belong with a man like him. She should be in a fine house in the city, married to a banker or a lawyer, someone who could give her the life her beauty deserved. What was she doing answering his advertisement? What was she doing riding in a rough wagon up a mountain trail? I had no other choice, Eleanor said, suddenly breaking the silence. Jacob didn't respond, but she continued anyway. My husband died 2 years ago. I found out after he passed that he'd left me with nothing but debts. Everything I owned was taken to pay what he owed. I tried to find work, but she paused. There was no work that would support me. I was going to end up on the streets. When I saw your letter at the agency, something about it felt honest. Real. I thought perhaps I could build a life with someone like you. So you lied to me, Jacob said. Yes. Her voice was quiet. I lied. I was afraid you wouldn't accept me if you knew what I looked like. I was afraid you'd think I was looking for something you couldn't provide. And aren't you? He finally looked at her. Look at you, look at me. We don't belong together. You could have married any man you wanted back east. If that were true, I wouldn't be here, Eleanor said. There was an edge to her voice now. Do you think I wanted to travel 1,500 miles to marry a stranger? Do you think this was my first choice? I'm not some princess looking for adventure. I'm a desperate woman who ran out of options. Her honesty stung worse than the deception somehow. Jacob turned his attention back to the road. The horses plodded on, and the silence returned heavier than before. The sun was starting to set when they finally turned onto the narrow trail that led to Jacob's cabin. Eleanor looked around nervously. They'd left the main road miles back. There were no other houses, no other signs of people, just endless forest and the sound of a distant creek. How far are we from town? She asked. 12 miles, Jacob said. Takes about 3 hours with the wagon. Longer in winter when the snow's deep. He saw her face pale slightly, but she didn't say anything. When the cabin came into view, Jacob watched her reaction from the corner of his eye. He saw her take it in. The small wooden structure, the rough barn nearby, the vegetable garden that was mostly dead for the season. This was nothing like what she was used to. He could tell that much. He stopped the wagon and climbed down, then lifted her trunks from the back. Eleanor climbed down on her own, wobbling slightly on legs tired from the long ride. This is it, Jacob said. Inside there's a main room with the kitchen and a bedroom through that door. Outhouses around back, wells over there. Eleanor nodded slowly, looking at everything. Jacob carried her trunks inside and set them down. The cabin felt smaller with her in it. She seemed to fill the space with her presence, making him acutely aware of how rough everything was. The simple furniture he'd made himself. The dishes stacked on the shelf. The worn rug on the floor. It's clean, Eleanor said, and he couldn't tell if she was surprised or just making an observation. I keep it clean, Jacob said defensively. An awkward silence fell between them. They stood there in the small cabin, two strangers who were supposed to be married, neither knowing what to do next. I'll sleep in the barn, Jacob said finally. You can have the bedroom. That's not necessary. Yes, it is. His voice was firm. I won't. We're not. I need time to think about this. Eleanor's face flushed. Of course. I understand. Jacob grabbed a blanket from the chest by the wall. There's food in the cupboard. Help yourself. I'll be back in the morning to start the fire. He walked out before she could respond, closing the door behind him. As he crossed the yard to the barn, he could feel her watching him from the window. He didn't look back. Inside the barn, he made a bed in the hay next to his horse. The animal snorted softly as if questioning his master's choice. Jacob lay down and stared up at the dark ceiling. What was he going to do? He couldn't send her back. He didn't have the money for her return fare, and besides, she'd already told him she had nowhere to go. But how could they make this work? Every time he looked at her, he was reminded of how wrong this all was. She didn't belong here. She didn't belong with him, and yet something in her eyes when she'd told him about her husband's debts, about having no other choice, that had been real. That had been honest in a way that cut through all the deception about her appearance. Jacob pulled the blanket up and tried to sleep. But all he could see when he closed his eyes was her face, beautiful, frightened, and far from home. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow he'd figure out what to do. But deep down he already knew the truth. She was here now, and somehow they'd have to find a way to live with that. The first 2 weeks passed in an uncomfortable rhythm. Jacob would wake before dawn in the barn, come into the cabin to start the fire, then leave again before Eleanor fully woke. He'd spend his entire day working in the forest, cutting timber until his muscles screamed. He only came back to the cabin when it was dark, ate whatever Eleanor had prepared in silence, then returned to the barn. Eleanor tried to make herself useful. She'd never done much housework back in Boston. There had always been servants for that. But here there was no one but her. She learned to cook on the wood stove, burning her first 3 attempts at bread before finally getting it right. She swept the floors, washed clothes in the cold creek water until her hands were raw and red, and tried to tend the garden even though most of it was already dying for the season. The work was harder than anything she'd ever done. Her back ached constantly. Her hands, once soft, were now covered in blisters and cuts. But she refused to complain. She refused to give Jacob any reason to think she couldn't handle this life. Still, the silence between them was wearing on her. They were living like strangers, barely speaking beyond the necessary words about meals and chores. Sometimes she'd catch him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, but the moment their eyes met, he'd turn away. One morning, she woke to find frost covering the windows. Winter was coming faster than she'd expected. Eleanor wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and went outside to get water from the well. The bucket was heavier than usual, and as she tried to lift it, the handle slipped from her cold fingers. The bucket fell back down the well with a splash. She stood there, staring down into the darkness, fighting back tears of frustration. It was such a small thing, but somehow it felt like the final straw. Everything was hard here. Everything took twice as long as it should, and she was so tired of being alone, even with Jacob just 100 feet away in the barn. "You need to use both hands." Jacob's voice came from behind her. She turned. He was standing there with an armful of firewood, watching her. "I know that now," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Jacob set down the wood and walked over to the well. He pulled up the bucket with ease and set it down beside her. "Water's getting colder. You need to be careful not to let your hands get wet out here. In another month you could lose fingers to frostbite." It was the most he'd said to her in days. Eleanor nodded, picking up the bucket with both hands this time. "Thank you," she said. He just nodded and went back to his firewood. But something had shifted, even if only slightly. A few days later, Eleanor decided to do the laundry in the creek, like she'd seen mentioned in one of her books about frontier life. She gathered up the clothes and soap and walked down to where the water ran clear and fast. The air was cold, but the sun was out, and she thought it would be manageable. She was wrong. The water was freezing. Within minutes, her hands were numb. But she kept scrubbing, determined to get the clothes clean. She was working on one of Jacob's shirts when her foot slipped on a wet rock. She fell forward, plunging into the creek. The cold was like 1,000 knives stabbing into her skin. The current was stronger than it looked, and it pulled her downstream. She tried to stand, but her heavy skirts dragged her down. Water filled her mouth and nose. Panic took over, and she thrashed wildly. Then strong hands grabbed her arms and yanked her up. Jacob pulled her out of the water and onto the bank, where she collapsed, coughing and gasping. "What were you thinking?" His voice was rough with fear and anger. "That creek's fed by snowmelt. You could have died." Eleanor couldn't answer. Her teeth were chattering too hard. Jacob scooped her up in his arms like she weighed nothing and carried her back to the cabin. He kicked the door open and set her down in front of the stove, which was thankfully burning hot. "Get out of those wet clothes," he ordered, turning his back to her. "There's a blanket on the bed. Wrap yourself in it." Eleanor's fingers were so numb she could barely work the buttons. She struggled with her dress, tears of frustration and cold streaming down her face. Finally, she managed to get it off along with her other wet things. She grabbed the blanket and wrapped it around herself. "I'm covered," she managed to say through chattering teeth. Jacob turned around and started stoking the fire, adding more wood to make it hotter. Then he poured her a cup of coffee from the pot that was always warming on the stove. "Drink this," he said, pressing the cup into her shaking hands. They sat there in silence for a while, Eleanor gradually warming up, Jacob sitting across from her with his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said finally. "I was just trying to help. I didn't realize you can't just do things without knowing how to do them safely," Jacob interrupted. "This isn't Boston. Out here, mistakes can kill you. I know that." Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I haven't noticed that everything here is harder than I ever imagined? I'm trying, Jacob. I'm trying so hard to prove to you that I can do this." Jacob looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, his expression softened slightly. "Why? Why what? Why are you trying so hard?" He leaned back in his chair. "You could tell me you want to leave. I'd understand. I'd find a way to get you the money for a ticket back east." Eleanor set down her coffee cup. The blanket slipped slightly from her shoulders, but she pulled it back up. "And then what? Go back to Boston and end up on the streets? Become one of those women who has to do things she never thought she'd do just to survive?" She shook her head. "I came here because I had no other choice, that's true. But I've stayed because I want to make this work. Because despite how hard everything is, I feel more alive here than I ever did back there. Does that make sense?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "A woman like you could have any man. Rich men, educated men, men who could give you a comfortable life. Why would you settle for someone like me?" Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the doubt in his eyes, the way he held himself like he was bracing for rejection. And suddenly she understood. He wasn't keeping his distance because he didn't want her. He was keeping his distance because he was afraid. "Jacob," she said quietly, "I don't want rich men or educated men. Most of them are like my late husband was, all charm and promises with nothing solid underneath. Do you know what I see when I look at you?" He didn't answer, just watched her. "I see a man who built this cabin with his own hands, a man who does honest work, a man who saved my life today even though he's been angry with me since I arrived. I see someone real." Jacob stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his back to her. His shoulders were tense. "You lied to me about who you were." "I lied about what I looked like," Eleanor corrected. "Everything else I told you was true. I told you I was desperate. I told you I needed stability. I told you I was willing to work hard. All of that was honest. But why hide your appearance?" He turned to face her. "If you'd told me the truth, I never would have." He stopped himself. "Never would have what?" Eleanor pressed. "Never would have accepted me? That's exactly why I hid it. Because men like you think women like me are too good for them. Because you would have assumed I wanted things you couldn't provide. But you were wrong." Jacob crossed his arms. "You don't know what you're talking about, don't I?" Eleanor stood up, clutching the blanket around herself. "For 2 weeks you've been sleeping in a barn in the cold rather than share this cabin with me like a proper married couple. Not because you don't want me. I've seen how you look at me when you think I'm not watching. But because you've convinced yourself that somehow you're not good enough." The words hung in the air between them. Jacob's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. "I'm not the only one who's been dishonest," Eleanor continued. "You've been lying to yourself. You wrote that letter asking for a wife because you were lonely, because you wanted a partner. But the moment you got one, you pushed her away because she didn't match the picture you had in your mind." Jacob turned back to the window. His voice when he spoke was barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to be what you need." Eleanor felt her heart soften. She walked over to him, still wrapped in her blanket. "I don't need you to be anything other than what you are. I just need you to let me try. Let us try." He looked down at her, and for the first time she saw real vulnerability in his eyes. Not anger or doubt, but genuine fear of being hurt. "What if you leave?" he asked. "What if you wake up one day and realize this life isn't enough?" "What if I don't?" Eleanor challenged. "What if this is exactly where I'm meant to be?" Jacob didn't answer, but something in his expression changed. The wall he'd built between them showed its first crack. That night, Jacob didn't go back to the barn. He made a bed on the floor of the main room, close to the fire. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And as Eleanor lay in the bedroom, listening to him settle in for the night, she felt something that had been missing since she arrived. Hope. Things were different after that day. Jacob still kept some distance, but he started teaching Eleanor things. how to split wood properly so she wouldn't hurt herself, how to read the sky for coming weather, which plants near the cabin were useful and which ones to avoid. Small things, but each lesson felt like he was letting her into his world a little more. Eleanor listened carefully to everything he said. She was getting better at the daily tasks, though her hands stayed rough and sore, but she wore those calluses like badges of honor. Every blister earned was proof she was becoming the woman this life needed her to be. Then the first real snow came. Eleanor woke one morning to find everything outside covered in white. It was beautiful, but also frightening. The mountains looked different now, more imposing. Jacob was already up, reinforcing the barn and checking their supplies. "Storm's coming," he said when he came in for breakfast. "A big one. Could last several days. What do we do?" Eleanor asked. "We make sure we have everything we need inside. Wood, food, water. Once it starts, we won't be able to go out much." He paused. "And we'll need to stay warm. The temperature's going to drop hard." Eleanor nodded, trying not to show her nervousness. She'd never experienced a real mountain winter storm before. They spent the day preparing. Jacob brought in load after load of firewood, stacking it near the door. Eleanor filled every container they had with water. They moved food from the small storage shed into the cabin. By afternoon, the wind had picked up, and the first heavy snowflakes started falling. That's when they heard it. A shout from outside. Jacob grabbed his rifle and opened the door. A man was stumbling through the snow toward the cabin, leading a horse. He was holding his side, and even from a distance, Eleanor could see he was hurt. "Help!" the man called out. "Please, I need help." Jacob ran out and helped the stranger inside. Eleanor quickly pushed a chair near the fire. The man collapsed into it, breathing hard. He was younger than Jacob, maybe 30, with dark hair and refined features. His clothes, though now muddy and torn, had once been expensive. "What happened?" Jacob asked. "Horse threw me about 5 miles back," the man said, wincing. "I think I cracked some ribs. Been trying to find shelter before the storm hits." Eleanor brought a blanket and wrapped it around the man's shoulders. "Let me see," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The man looked surprised but nodded. Eleanor had helped care for her mother during her long illness, so she knew something about tending to the injured. She carefully felt along his ribs while he hissed in pain. "2 are definitely cracked," she said. "We need to wrap them tight." "Jacob, do we have any clean cloth?" Jacob went to find bandages, and Eleanor noticed him watching her with something like surprise. She helped the stranger remove his coat and shirt, then wrapped his ribs tightly while Jacob held the bandage in place. "Thank you," the man said once they were done. "Both of you. I'm Theodore Bennett. I was heading to the mining camp north of here when this happened." "You picked a bad time to travel," Jacob said, his voice neutral. "That storm's going to trap us all here for at least 3 days. Theodore's face fell. 3 days? "I have business. Your business can wait," Eleanor said firmly. "You're in no condition to travel anyway. You'll stay here until the storm passes and you're well enough to ride." Theodore looked at her with obvious appreciation. "You're very kind. And if I may say, very capable." Eleanor felt herself flush slightly at the compliment. It had been a long time since anyone had acknowledged her skills with such warmth. Jacob noticed. She could see his jaw tighten even as he said, "I'll take care of your horse." He went outside and Eleanor busied herself making soup for their unexpected guest. Theodore watched her work, and unlike Jacob, he had no trouble making conversation. "How long have you been living here?" he asked. "Just a few weeks," Eleanor admitted. "Really? You seem so at home with everything." He smiled. "Are you from around here originally?" "Boston, actually." Theodore's eyebrows rose. "Boston? That's quite a change. What brought you all the way out here?" Eleanor hesitated. "I married Jacob through a correspondence arrangement." "Ah." Something shifted in Theodore's expression. "Well, he's a lucky man. Not many women from Boston would be willing to take on this kind of life." The storm hit that evening, just as Jacob had predicted. The wind howled around the cabin and snow piled up against the windows. Jacob came in from securing the barn, covered in snow, and Eleanor quickly helped him out of his wet coat. They ate dinner together, the 3 of them crowded around the small table. Theodore told stories about his travels, about cities he'd visited and people he'd met. He'd been to Boston several times and knew some of the same streets Eleanor had walked. He asked about her life there, about the theater and the symphony, things she hadn't thought about in weeks. Eleanor found herself laughing at his stories, enjoying the easy conversation. It reminded her of dinners she used to have in her old life, before everything fell apart. Jacob stayed quiet through most of the meal. He ate his food and listened, but he didn't join in. Eleanor kept trying to include him in the conversation, but he'd only give short answers before falling silent again. After dinner, Theodore praised Eleanor's cooking. "That was delicious. You're quite talented." "Thank you," Eleanor said, "though I've had to learn a lot since coming here. I wasn't much of a cook before." "I find that hard to believe," Theodore said warmly. "You seem like someone who excels at everything she tries." Jacob stood abruptly. "I need to check the fire in the barn." "In this storm?" Eleanor asked, concerned. "Can't it wait?" "No," Jacob said shortly. He grabbed his coat and went out into the blizzard before either of them could stop him. Theodore watched him go with a knowing look. "I think I may have overstayed my welcome." "Don't be silly," Eleanor said, though she was worried. "He's just—" Jacob's not used to company, but she knew it was more than that. She'd seen the look on Jacob's face every time Theodore made her laugh. Every time he complimented her. Every time he brought up the life she used to have. An hour passed and Jacob didn't return. The storm was getting worse. Eleanor paced by the window, trying to see through the snow. "He shouldn't be out there this long," she said. "Perhaps I should go look for him," Theodore offered, though he winced as he stood. "You're injured. You'll just make things worse." Eleanor grabbed her shawl. "I'll go. In this storm? You'll get lost. It's just to the barn. I can follow the rope Jacob tied between the buildings." She went out before Theodore could argue further. The cold hit her like a wall and the wind nearly knocked her over. She grabbed the guide rope and pulled herself along it step by step until she reached the barn. Inside, Jacob was sitting on a hay bale, staring at nothing. The barn was cold, barely warmer than outside. "Jacob," Eleanor said, "what are you doing out here?" He looked up at her and she saw something raw in his expression. "Go back inside. You'll freeze. Not without you." She sat down beside him, pulling her shawl tighter. "Talk to me." "What's wrong?" "What's wrong?" He laughed bitterly. "You really don't see it?" "See what?" "Him." Jacob gestured toward the cabin. "The way he looks at you. The way you light up when he talks about Boston and theaters and all the things I can't give you." Eleanor's breath caught. "Jacob, he's educated, charming. He can talk about books and music and all those things you used to know. He can make you laugh." Jacob's voice cracked slightly.
"He's everything I'm not. That's not true, isn't it?"
Jacob turned to face her. "Listen to yourself when you talk to him. You're different. You're the woman you used to be, the one who belongs in Boston drawing rooms, not in a cabin in the middle of nowhere." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of frustration. "Is that really what you think? That I want to go back to that life? Don't you?" He challenged. "Be honest. When he talks about the city, don't you miss it?"
"Maybe for a moment," Eleanor admitted.
"But missing something isn't the same as wanting it back." "Jacob, I left that life behind. I chose to come here." "I chose you." "You chose survival," Jacob said quietly. "That's not the same thing." Eleanor grabbed his hand, forcing him to look at her. "Listen to me. Yes, I came here out of desperation, but I'm staying because I want to. Because in these few weeks I've felt more real, more alive than I did in years back in Boston. That life was full of pretty things and empty promises. This life is hard, but it's honest. You're honest. He could give you more than I can. I don't want more. I want this. I want you." She squeezed his hand. "But I can't keep proving that to you every single day. At some point, you have to decide to believe me." Jacob stared at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the silence stretched between them. Then he pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. She felt him trembling, though whether from cold or emotion she couldn't tell. "I'm scared," he whispered into her hair. "I'm scared of losing you." "Then stop pushing me away," Eleanor whispered back. "Let me in. Really let me in." They sat there in the cold barn, holding each other while the storm raged outside. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Eleanor felt like they were finally on the same side. When they went back to the cabin together, Theodore took one look at them and smiled knowingly. He asked no questions, just moved his blankets to give them space by the fire. That night, Jacob didn't sleep on the floor. He took Eleanor's hand and led her to the bedroom. And though the storm continued for 3 more days inside the cabin, something warm and new was beginning to bloom. The storm finally broke on the 4th day. Theodore's ribs were healing well enough for him to travel, though Eleanor insisted he stay 1 more night to be safe. He agreed, but there was a knowingness in his smile when he looked at Jacob and Eleanor together now. Something had clearly changed between them. Before Theodore left the next morning, he shook Jacob's hand. "You've got something special here," he said. "Don't let fear make you forget that." Jacob nodded, and for once, he didn't look away. After Theodore rode off toward the mining camp, Jacob and Eleanor stood together in the doorway, watching him disappear into the white landscape. Jacob put his arm around Eleanor's waist and she leaned into him. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. Winter settled in hard after that. The snow piled higher, and some days they couldn't even open the door. But inside the cabin, things were different now. Jacob no longer kept his distance. They worked together, ate together, talked late into the night by the fire. Eleanor learned that Jacob wasn't uneducated like he'd claimed. He simply hadn't had much schooling. But he was smart in ways that mattered out here. He could read weather and animal tracks. He understood the forest and the seasons, and Eleanor taught him things too. She read to him from the few books she'd brought, and his hunger for stories surprised her. He'd sit and listen for hours, his eyes fixed on her face as she brought distant worlds to life with her words. One evening in late January, Eleanor realized something. Her monthly courses hadn't come. At first, she thought it was just the stress and the change in her life. But when February came and went with no sign, she knew she was carrying Jacob's child. The knowledge filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. Out here, so far from any doctor, childbirth was dangerous. Women died in childbirth even in cities with medical care. Out here, with just Jacob to help her, the risks were even higher. She waited a week before telling him, trying to find the right moment. Finally, one morning while they were having breakfast, she simply said it. "Jacob, I'm going to have a baby." He froze with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly, his face going pale. "You're sure?" "Yes, I'm about 2 months along, I think." Jacob stood up and walked to the window. He stood there for a long time, not speaking. Eleanor's heart sank. Maybe he didn't want children. Maybe this was too much for him. Then he turned around and she saw tears on his face. "I'm going to be a father?" Eleanor nodded, her own eyes filling with tears. Is that all right?" Jacob crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. "All right? Eleanor, His voice broke. "I never thought I'd have this. A wife, a child. A real family." They held each other, both crying, both overwhelmed by the weight and wonder of it all. But as the weeks passed, Eleanor noticed Jacob becoming more and more anxious. He worried constantly about her health. He wouldn't let her do any heavy work. He'd wake in the night and check to make sure she was breathing. She understood his fear, she felt it too, but his constant worry was starting to suffocate her. "Jacob, I'm pregnant, not dying," she finally said one day when he tried to stop her from carrying a bucket of water. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." "Not my woman," he said stubbornly. "Not if I can help it." Eleanor softened at that. She touched his face. "I know you're scared." "I'm scared too, but we can't spend the next 7 months living in fear. We have to trust that things will be all right. And if they're not?" The question hung in the air between them. "Eleanor, if something happened to you, Nothing's going to happen to me," she said firmly. "I'm strong. Stronger than you think. Stronger than I ever knew I was." As spring came and the snow began to melt, they started making plans. Jacob decided they needed a bigger cabin. The current one was too small for a family, so they began building an addition, working side by side. Eleanor insisted on helping despite Jacob's protests. "I'm pregnant, not helpless," she reminded him daily. The work was slow but satisfying. Each board they nailed in place, each window frame they installed, felt like they were building their future together. Neighbors from down the mountain, people Eleanor hadn't even known existed, came to help with the heavy work. She learned that the mountain community took care of its own, especially when a baby was coming. The women brought her advice and old remedies. They shared their own birth stories, some frightening, some encouraging. One older woman, Mrs. Peterson, who lived 6 miles away, promised to come when Eleanor's time came. She delivered dozens of babies in these mountains and knew what to do. Summer arrived and Eleanor grew round with child. Jacob would sit with his hand on her belly, feeling the baby kick, a look of wonder on his face every single time. "What if I'm not a good father?" he asked one night. "What if you are?" Eleanor countered. "Jacob, you're the most reliable, hard-working, honest man I know. That baby is lucky to have you. I want to be better for them. For both of you." He looked at Eleanor. "I've been thinking, maybe I should learn to read better, so I can read to our child, like you read to me." Eleanor felt her heart swell. "I think that's a wonderful idea." So they added that to their evening routine. After dinner, Eleanor would teach Jacob his letters and words. He learned slowly but steadily, his determination making up for his lack of early education. Watching him trace letters carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration, Eleanor felt a surge of love so strong it almost hurt. This was nothing like her first marriage. Her first husband had been charming and well-spoken, but there had been no depth to him. Jacob was the opposite. Every word he spoke was considered. Every action was deliberate. He was a man you could build a life with, build a future with. In August, when the summer heat made Eleanor uncomfortable and tired, a traveling photographer passed through the area. Jacob insisted they have a photograph taken together. "I want our child to see this," he explained. "I want them to know what their mother looked like when she was carrying them." "How beautiful she was," Eleanor laughed. "I'm huge and sweaty and my ankles are swollen." "You're beautiful," Jacob insisted. "You're everything." They stood together for the photograph, Jacob's arm around Eleanor's shoulders, her hand resting on her swollen belly. The photographer told them to look serious, as was the custom, but Eleanor could see the hint of a smile at the corners of Jacob's mouth. She felt it on her own lips, too. 2 weeks later, on a hot August afternoon, Eleanor's labor began. It started with a dull ache in her back while she was making bread. Then the pains began coming in waves. Jacob went pale when she told him. "I'll get Mrs. Peterson," he said, already moving toward the door. "There's time," Eleanor said, trying to sound calm even though her heart was racing. "First babies take a while." But Jacob was already running for his horse. Eleanor watched him go, then turned back to the cabin. She had things to prepare, cloths to boil, the bed to make ready. She'd been preparing for this moment for months, but now that it was here, the reality of it hit her. She was about to bring a child into the world, out here with no real medical help, just her strength, Mrs. Peterson's experience, and Jacob's love. Jacob returned with Mrs. Peterson within 2 hours. The older woman took one look at Eleanor and nodded approvingly. "You're doing fine, dear. Let's get you comfortable." The labor went on through the afternoon and into the evening. Jacob stayed by Eleanor's side, holding her hand, whispering encouragement. When the pain got bad, she squeezed his hand so hard she thought she might break it, but he never once pulled away. "I've got you," he kept saying. "You're so strong. You can do this." Outside, a summer storm rolled in. Thunder shook the cabin and rain pounded on the roof. Eleanor barely noticed. All her focus was on the work her body was doing. Finally, as lightning lit up the night sky, their daughter was born. Mrs. Peterson placed the tiny, red, screaming baby in Eleanor's arms. Eleanor looked down at her daughter's face and started crying. Jacob knelt beside the bed, staring at both of them with an expression of complete awe. "She's perfect," he whispered. "You're both perfect." Eleanor looked up at her husband, this man she'd come to by chance and stayed with by choice. This man who'd been afraid to trust her, afraid to love her, but who'd learned to do both. "We did it," she said softly. Jacob kissed her forehead, then gently touched his daughter's tiny hand. The baby wrapped her fingers around his thumb, holding on tight. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We did." Mrs. Peterson left the next morning after making sure Eleanor and the baby were both healthy. Jacob walked her to her horse, thanking her over and over. "That wife of yours is strong," Mrs. Peterson said. "And you're a good man, Jacob Thornwood. You'll both do just fine." After she left, Jacob came back inside to find Eleanor sitting up in bed nursing their daughter. He sat beside them, putting his arm around his wife. "What should we name her?" Eleanor asked. They'd discussed names before, but none of them had felt quite right. Now looking at their daughter, Jacob said, "Hope, because that's what you brought me. Hope for a future I never thought I'd have," Eleanor smiled. "Hope Thornwood. I like that." As the baby nursed, Eleanor thought about her journey. She'd left Boston as a desperate woman with nowhere else to go. She'd lied about her appearance to secure a future. She'd arrived on this mountain expecting nothing more than survival, but she'd found so much more than that. She'd found honest work that made her strong. She'd found a community that accepted her. She'd found a man who loved her not despite who she was but because of it. A man who'd learned to trust, to hope, to dream. She'd expected a plain life with a mountain man. Instead, she'd found a beautiful life filled with real love. And as Jacob held her close, his lips pressed to her hair, his hand gentle on their daughter's head, Eleanor knew she was finally, truly home.